Lost, then found. My name is Daniel, and I come from a small town in rural Kentucky surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests. Growing up, I was always drawn to the great outdoors and spent much of my childhood hunting and fishing in the nearby woods. Despite being an only child, I never felt alone in the wilderness, as the trees, streams, and wildlife felt like my family. My mother was more than just a parent to me. She was my best friend and my biggest supporter. She was always there to encourage me in my love for the great outdoors, and she would often accompany me on camping trips and share her own love for nature. My father, on the other hand, was the strong, silent type. He was a skilled hunter, and he taught me everything I know about surviving in the wilderness. The two of them were the cornerstone of my world. Unfortunately, for my small family, things were about to take a turn for the worse. A few years ago, my mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, a particularly aggressive and difficult form of the disease. Despite the grim prognosis, she never lost sight of her will to live and fought the cancer with everything she had. Her passing was a devastating blow to both myself and my father. The emptiness that filled our lives after her death was overwhelming, and my father, in grief, became increasingly more isolated. He was looking for answers about what happens after you die and what the purpose of life was. The loss of my mother was a turning point for him, and as time passed, my father's behavior became increasingly more erratic. He became more and more withdrawn, spending long hours alone in the woods and sometimes disappearing for days at a time. He was searching for answers, but all he found was more questions. It was the summer before last, when my father decided to go on another one of his long trips to the wilderness in search of more solitude. What happened next, no one's for sure. But what I do know is that he never returned from that trip. At first, I wasn't too concerned, thinking that he had simply gone off on a longer trip than usual. But as time passed, I began to feel a sense of unease grow within me. Days and days went by, and still there was no sign of my father. I knew in my heart that something was off, that my father wouldn't have stayed away for this long without contacting me. I talked to people in the area, searching for any information that could help me find him. But no one had seen or heard from him, and I was left with more questions than answers. The local authorities launched a search effort, but it was soon called off due to lack of leads. As the days passed, my anxiety and fear grew. I felt as though I was running out of time, and that I was the only one who cared about finding my father. Eventually, days turned into weeks and then into months. I began to lose hope that I would ever find him. The lack of leads and the fact that no one had seen or heard from him made it seem as though he had vanished into thin air. I was left to accept the fact that I was now completely alone in this world. Even though the loss of my parents weighed heavily on me, I was forced to try and find purpose in my life. Despite the loss of my parents, I was grateful to have a few good friends from high school who had all settled down in our hometown. We would get together every now and then to catch up and reminisce about old times. One of my friends, Jake, planned a camping trip about 45 minutes from where my father had disappeared 2 years prior. At first, I was hesitant to go, but I thought it would be good for me to get out of the house and into the great outdoors. As I packed my gear and made preparations for the trip, memories of my mother and father flooded my mind. I couldn't help but think about my father's disappearance and wonder if there was anything that I had missed in my search for him. Despite these thoughts, I was excited for the trip and the opportunity to reconnect with nature and my friends. The trip turned out to be just what I needed. We spent 3 days camping, fishing, and hiking in the surrounding woods. The peace and tranquility of the wilderness was a balm for my soul, and I felt as though I was finally able to let go of some of my grief. It wasn't until the end of our camping trip, on my way home, that things got strange. I was driving back home alone, lost in thought and still trying to process the events of the trip. The road was quiet, and the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I had driven this road countless times before, and it was a familiar and comforting stretch of highway. However, as I rounded a bend in the road, I was suddenly jolted out of my thoughts by a strange sensation. It was as though a cold hand had reached out and touched me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked around, trying to see what had caused the feeling, but there was nothing there. The woods were quiet, and there was no one in sight. I brushed off the feeling and continued down the road, but the sensation only grew stronger. It was as though something was trying to get my attention, trying to tell me something. I couldn't shake the feeling, and I felt as though I was being drawn towards something, like a moth to a flame. As I continued down the road, the sun had finally set and darkness was fast approaching. Over the next mile or so, I noticed the road conditions became more and more foggy. Typically this isn't very uncommon, however something still felt off. The feeling of unease only grew stronger as I drove through the dense fog. The road ahead of me was obscured, and I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of my car. I slowed down, trying to be cautious. I felt as though I was being led towards something, and I couldn't resist the pull. Suddenly, I saw a figure in the distance. It was a man, standing by the side of the road, his back to me. I couldn't make out his features, but I felt a sense of familiarity wash over me. I pulled over to the side of the road and got out of my car, trying to get a better look at the figure. As I approached, he turned to face me, and I felt my heart skip a beat. It was my father. He looked older, more weathered, but there was no mistaking those familiar features. I stumbled backwards, overcome with emotion. I had finally found him. I wanted to run to him, to embrace him, but something held me back. "Dad?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is that you?" He didn't answer, but instead turned toward me directly. He just stood there with a blank expression on his face. I spoke out once more, "Dad?" That's when his head violently twisted to one side, like I had his attention. The man started to stumble awkwardly toward me. I was frozen, unsure of what to do. As he approached, I could see that his clothes were torn and tattered, and there were bruises and cuts all over his face. "Dad?" I said again, this time more cautiously. The man continued to shuffle closer, and I could see that his eyes were glassy and vacant. I took a step back, my heart racing in my chest. This man might have looked like my father, but there was something off about him, something that made me fear for my safety. His body started contorting, bones sounding as if they were breaking and limbs starting to grow longer and more lanky. The face became more and more ominous, and I realized that this was not my father, but something else entirely. I turned trying to get back into my car, my hands shaking, as I scrambled inside and locked the doors. The creature had made its way to the side of my car, its claws scratching at the windows and its howls echoing through the dense fog. I turned the key in the ignition, hitting the gas as soon as the engine roared to life. I could feel the car lurch forward, the wheels spinning as I tried to put as much distance as possible between me and that thing. I could see it in my rearview mirror as I sped off, running on all fours and chasing me. Its form was twisted and contorted, bones breaking and reforming as it moved with unnatural speed. I was completely shaken to my core, fear clutching at my heart as I drove as fast as I could through the dense fog. I don't know how long I drove, but eventually I emerged from the fog and I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands still shaking as I tried to catch my breath. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I didn't know what to think, but one thing was for certain, my father was truly gone forever and I would never be the same again. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like and subscribe to stay up to date with our latest content.